October 1874. By the second hour of the firestorm, Ash Hollow was disappearing. The flames had simply erased it. Across the tallgrass plain, walls of red and orange rolled forward at the speed of a running horse. Sod houses baked and collapsed. Timber homesteads vanished in columns of black smoke. In the settlement below, families ran with children in their arms, chased by heat that scorched the lungs before it ever touched the skin. Yet, a strange rumor moved ahead of the fire. One patch of earth on the ridge was not burning. Most refused to believe it. Nothing stops a prairie fire. Not in that grass, not in that wind. 2 miles east of the burning valley, William Hale stood atop a low mound of packed sod and watched the horizon glow. He listened. Around him, the wind carried embers like stinging snow. Behind him, the walls of his half-finished sod house held their ground against the heat. His plow horse, Juno, stood inside a shallow trench of turned earth, ears pinned back but calm. Across the barren dirt, his old collie, Ranger, lay watching the fire line, tail flat against the ground. The animal had not moved for an hour. He simply waited, as if the prairie had already decided who would live. While the settlement below lost its fight against the flames, the ground inside William's plowed firebreak remained dark and quiet. It was doing exactly what he had calculated it would do. But why had he trusted bare dirt when everyone else trusted timber walls? 8 months earlier, Ash Hollow looked nothing like the place the fire would eventually swallow. Land agent Thaddeus Boone stood behind a warped counter while a plat map lay open between them. Fresh homesteads covered the river bottoms. Cottonwood stands, deep grass, easy water. Every newcomer fought for those parcels. William Hale ignored every one of them. His finger moved past the timbered claims, past the creek lots, past a section already spoken for by a family from Ohio. Then it stopped on a bare, wind-scoured ridge 2 miles from the settlement. Boone leaned over his ledger and squinted. "That parcel," William nodded. The agent frowned harder. "There's no wood, no water within half a mile. Grass thick as a bear pelt for 200 acres in every direction." He paused. "That's not a homestead. That's a grave with edges." William did not answer immediately. His left sleeve hung stiffer than his right, the arm inside it healed but not fully healed. His face, still weathered from 4 years of soldiering, gave nothing away. The room grew quiet. When William said he intended to cut his walls from the ground itself, 2 men waiting near the door laughed aloud. One shook his head. Another muttered something about veterans who had come home wrong. William's wife, Sarah, remained silent beside him. Boone studied the ridge again, certain he had misunderstood. Why would a man choose this ground? William reached across the map and tapped the empty parcel. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Because that's the reason I want the land." For a moment, nobody knew what he meant. That only made the claim more interesting. Long before he claimed the bare ridge, William Hale had spent 4 years watching what fire did to open ground. He had seen artillery grass burn in Georgia. He had watched cavalry columns cut wide furrows to save whole camps. He had lain flat on charred prairie in Kansas and felt the heat pass over him where the plow had already turned the earth. Fire, he had learned, was not a wall you fought. It was a hunger you starved. And the men who died were the ones who did not understand the difference. Sarah Hale was the first to hear the plan spoken plainly. The daughter of a Nebraska homesteader who had lost 2 brothers to a grass fire in '68, she understood open country better than most. She knew that timber burned. She knew that dirt did not. When William described cutting his walls from the sod itself and plowing a break wide enough to swallow embers before they reached the door, she did not laugh. She asked about roof pitch. She asked about drainage. She asked how thick the walls would have to be to hold their shape through a wet spring. Where others saw a treeless graveyard, William saw a shelter waiting to be lifted from the ground. A week after filing the claim, William and Sarah drove a borrowed wagon to the ridge carrying little more than a breaking plow, a hand scythe, and a pair of long knives sharpened to a razor edge. The parcel looked hopeless from the wagon seat. Up close it began to speak. The ground rose gently toward a broad, windswept crown. Prairie grass grew thick and deep, the roots woven together like coarse rope. When William pushed the blade of his knife into the sod, it came up in a solid mat almost 4 inches thick. He weighed a single piece in his good hand and nodded slowly. The sod was heavy. Heavy meant dense. Dense meant strong. Sarah knelt and pressed her palm against the earth beneath the cut. The soil was cool, firm, undisturbed by rodents. She traced the slope with her eyes and pointed toward the natural fall of the land. Water would run away from the house, not toward it. William marked the spot where the door would face. East, away from the prevailing wind. Away from the direction fire almost always came. Most settlers built houses that stood against the prairie. They raised walls of hauled cottonwood, filled the gaps with mud, and hoped the roof would hold through a hailstorm. William envisioned something different. His house would not stand against the prairie. It would be made of the prairie. Grass roots pressed into walls 2 feet thick, laid brick over brick, bound together by the same soil that had held them for 1,000 years. Sarah studied the sketch he unrolled across a flat stone. After a long silence, she added a single suggestion. Plow the break before you cut the first brick. William looked up. Fire won't wait until the walls are finished. He folded the sketch and slid it into his coat. By sunset, the system already existed between them. Sod for the walls, bare earth for the perimeter. A wide, plowed ring of turned soil circling the homestead like a moat with no water in it. The house itself would simply anchor everything else in place. News traveled quickly across the settlement. By the 3rd week, men were riding out to the ridge on Sundays just to see the strange claim for themselves. One afternoon, Scott Brennan, the loudest voice at the general store and the owner of the largest timber homestead in the valley, reined his sorrel mare to a stop at the edge of the plowed ring. He tipped his hat back and studied the 2 rows of sod bricks already stacked against a wooden frame. A slow grin spread across his face. "My house cost $400 in cottonwood and nails," he said. "You could have bought yourself half of that." Several riders behind him chuckled. Scott gestured toward the walls. "Instead, you're building a barn for prairie dogs." William continued laying sod. The blade of his cutting knife rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The reaction only encouraged the crowd. Before long, new names began circulating through the settlement. Some called him Dirt Willie. Others preferred the Mole. The most popular was the half-armed fool. William heard every one of them. The prairie offered no opinion. Not everyone rode out to the ridge for entertainment. A few came because they genuinely believed the project would kill him. Among them was Jonas Reeve, the closest thing Ash Hollow had to a master builder. Reeve had raised half the timber houses in the valley and considered himself a man who knew what walls could and could not do. He spent nearly an hour walking the plowed perimeter before speaking. "Sod holds water," he said at last. "Water rots roof beams. Give this place 3 spring rains and you'll be sleeping under open sky." His concerns continued. Roof loading, wall settling, insect infestation, snake dens forming in the seams between bricks. He warned about mice tunneling through the base. He warned about walls slumping outward as the sod dried. Each objection came from experience. William listened carefully and answered each one. He described the double thickness of the outer wall, the sharp roof pitch that would shed rain instead of hold it, the trench of raw clay packed along the foundation to seal out burrowing animals. Reeve remained unconvinced. Before mounting his horse, the builder rested one hand on a stacked row of sod. "You're building a house that wants to fall down," he said. "Every season is going to pull it back into the ground." Afterward, William returned to work. The words stayed with him longer than the laughter had. By late summer, the project had become part of everyday conversation at the general store. Schoolteacher Mary Callender mentioned it during a lesson on frontier progress. To her, the sod house represented a step backward. Civilization moved toward sawmills, glass windows, and painted clapboard. Living inside walls of dirt seemed to belong to a time the country was trying to leave behind. Land agent Thaddeus Boone raised a different concern. He warned that an unusual claim like Williams could cause complications when the parcel came up for final proving. More than once, he hinted that a homestead built of loose earth might not qualify as a permanent dwelling under the terms of the act. The suggestion carried weight, the laughter did not. Meanwhile, A new phrase entered local speech. Whenever a man tried something the settlement did not understand, people called it digging like hail. The joke spread faster than the facts. Only one person seemed more interested in watching than judging. Dr. Ephraim Locke, the settlement's aging physician, rode past the ridge every Thursday on his rounds. He never joined the mockery. He simply nodded at William from the saddle and continued down the trail. On some evenings, that quiet acknowledgement made William feel more visible than open ridicule ever had. Summer settled over the ridge, and the noise from the settlement slowly became background. Work filled the days. Before sunrise, William hitched Juno to the breaking plow and cut fresh strips of sod along a rotating pattern he had drawn out in advance. By midday, Sarah worked beside him, trimming the bricks to even thickness with a sharpened knife she wore on a leather cord around her waist. The Prairie surrendered nothing easily. Each brick weighed close to 50 pounds. Each row demanded that William lift with a body that no longer worked the way it once had. His left arm could grip, but it could not carry. Every load fell across his right shoulder. By evening, that shoulder burned in ways he refused to mention. Sarah noticed anyway. She rewrapped his arm each night without a word. Weeks passed beneath the steady rhythm of cutting, lifting, and stacking. The first wall to appear was the north face, 2 feet thick at the base. Rising slowly, brick by brick, against a wooden ridge pole William had traded for at the settlement mill. The east and south walls followed, then the west, doorway framed with the only cottonwood beams on the property. Ranger watched from the shade of the wagon, eyes tracking every movement. Sunday visitors became a regular occurrence. Families rode past on their way to and from services at the settlement chapel. Children pointed. Men offered opinions from horseback. Women exchanged doubtful glances. Yet each week revealed something new. A finished wall, a doorway. A shallow root cellar carved into the side of the ridge. Then windows, framed with reused glass William had traded a week of labor to obtain from the sawmill. Behind the house, another project took shape. William harnessed Juno to the breaking plow and began cutting a wide ring of turned earth around the entire homestead, 10 feet across at first, then 15, then 20. Sarah walked behind him with a hand tool, breaking up any clump of grass root that survived the blade. Nothing green could be left within the perimeter. Scott Brennan rode past one Sunday afternoon and stopped his mare at the edge of the plowed strip. He stared at the wide brown ring for a long moment. Then he laughed until his shoulders shook. "A moat," he called out. "Sarah, your husband's built himself a castle." He tipped his hat and rode on before William could answer. The jokes continued. So did the work. For William and Sarah, that was enough. Autumn arrived early and dry. At first, everything seemed to be working exactly as William had planned. The finished walls held their shape through 2 heavy rains. The roof, layered with sod over cottonwood beams, shed water cleanly. The small iron stove Sarah had brought from her mother's home warmed the interior quickly and held the heat well past midnight. Even the root cellar stayed cool through the last warm days of September. Then one morning changed the mood on the ridge. William was walking the plowed perimeter when he stopped near the northwest corner. The grass beyond the break stood taller than he remembered, drier too. He pulled a single stem from the ground and rolled it between his fingers. It snapped like straw. The moisture was already gone from the plains and the calendar had barely turned to October. He looked toward the horizon. The wind moved in a direction he did not like. For the next 3 days, William worked without pause. The plowed break grew wider. 20 feet became 25. 25 became 30. Juno pulled until her flanks trembled, and William rested her only when Sarah insisted. He turned the soil in overlapping passes so that no strip of untouched grass remained anywhere inside the ring. Then he took a hand rake and worked through every square foot, pulling out even the smallest tuft that had survived. Sarah asked once whether he was making the ring too large. William did not stop working. "A grass fire jumps," he said. "I saw one clear a road in Georgia. 20 feet meant nothing. 30 is the number I trust." He kept raking. By the end of the week, the homestead sat inside a bare brown circle visible from a mile away, a dark island in a sea of dry gold. Ranger walked the perimeter each morning as if inspecting the work. The old collie stopped at the northwest corner every time and stared toward the far horizon. William watched him do it. That afternoon, William hitched Juno to the wagon and drove down to the settlement. He carried a warning he had been reluctant to speak aloud. The grass was too dry. The wind was too steady. Fire season had arrived early, and the settlement was not ready. Scott Brennan heard him out at the general store and laughed before William finished his second sentence. Every autumn is dry, hail. Every autumn the wind blows. You think a man who lives in a dirt hole can teach the rest of us about weather? Several men behind him chuckled. William did not raise his voice. Jonas Reeve listened longer than Scott had, but the answer came out the same in the end. Grass burns every year, William, sometimes a mile, sometimes two, never enough to matter. We've got a creek on the west side and open pasture on the east. Fire never crosses either. He tapped his pipe against the doorframe of the store as he spoke. William watched the small shower of orange embers fall into the dirt at Reeves' feet. Nobody else noticed. Thaddeus Boone was less friendly. The land agent had heard rumors that William was warning families away from their own claims. "People already think you built that dirt house to prove a point," he said. "Now you're going door to door telling them their homes are going to burn. That kind of talk turns neighbors against each other, Hale. I'd advise you to stop." By afternoon, the warnings had gone nowhere. Only Dr. Ephraim Locke paused long enough to ask a real question. "When did you first notice the grass changing?" After hearing the answer, the old physician nodded slowly and made a note on a small pad he carried in his coat pocket. He said nothing else. He simply mounted his horse and rode toward the eastern edge of the settlement, where an elderly widow lived alone in a small timber cabin. The settlement returned to its routine. The Prairie did not. William did not return to Ash Hollow after that. There was nothing left to argue about. The next 2 days passed in steady preparation on the ridge. 2 extra water barrels were filled from the well and rolled against the north wall of the house. A shallow pit was dug beside the door and lined with wet sacks. Feed for Juno was moved into a covered trench William had cut into the side of the root cellar. Every wooden tool with a handle was carried inside the house and stacked against the interior wall. Sarah worked beside him through both days. She moved the linens and the small trunk that held her mother's letters into the deepest corner of the cellar. She soaked 3 heavy quilts in a barrel and laid them out flat on the packed dirt floor near the door, ready to be thrown over anything that needed shielding. She never once asked whether it was necessary. Meanwhile, Ranger stayed at the northwest corner of the plowed break. He no longer walked the perimeter. He simply sat facing the horizon, ears forward, and did not move except to lower his head when the wind shifted. On the second afternoon, William climbed to the top of the ridge with his old Army field glasses. He scanned the horizon slowly from north to south. Nothing showed against the sky. No smoke. No haze. Only a thin bronze color where the sun struck the dry grass at a low angle. He lowered the glasses and stood watching for a long time. Sarah joined him at the crown of the ridge. She did not speak at first. She only looked at his face and read what was written there. "Do you think it will come today?" For several seconds, William said nothing. His eyes remained on the horizon. Then he answered quietly, "It doesn't matter what I think." A slow gust of hot air rolled across the ridge and stirred the plowed dust at their feet. The Prairie already knows. After that, they walked back to the house together. The wind was steady out of the northwest by then. The sky above the settlement carried a strange copper tint that William had seen only once before, on a battlefield in Georgia, an hour before the grass caught fire and killed 9 men who had not thought to plow. The fire was coming, whether the settlement believed it or not. Ranger stood, and then it came in the middle of the afternoon. No second warning came with it. No slow build. No gradual darkening of the horizon. 1 hour the wind carried only heat and dust. The next, a thin gray line appeared along the northwest, thickened, rose, and became a wall of smoke that swallowed the sky in less than 20 minutes. The wind accelerated to 40 miles per hour, then higher. Embers began arriving before the fire itself, carried on the leading edge of the storm like sparks blown from a forge. Temperatures inside the smoke line climbed past anything the settlement had ever measured. Every dry stem of grass became fuel. Every fence post became a torch waiting for its match. In Ash Hollow, the first sign of danger was the smell. Burnt sweetgrass, sharp and unmistakable. Families stepped outside their doors and saw the horizon glowing. Some began wetting blankets. Some began loading wagons. Some simply stood and stared, unable to accept how fast the wall was moving. Scott Brennan was the first to understand. He had been standing on his front porch when the wind shifted. The pipe in his hand had gone out an hour earlier. He tapped the bowl against the porch rail and watched the ashes fall into the tall grass at the edge of his yard. He turned to walk inside. He never saw the small orange point that stayed behind in the dry stems. By the time the smell reached his kitchen, the fire he had started was already half a mile wide and running with the wind. Across the ridge, William stood at the edge of his plowed break and watched the smoke climb. Sarah was inside the house, moving the last of the water barrels against the north wall. Juno was already inside the shallow trench William had cut for her, tied loosely to a stake driven deep into the turned earth. Ranger sat at the northwest corner, exactly where he had been for 2 days, and did not move. William raised his field glasses one final time. The fire line was closer than he had expected, faster than he had expected. He could see individual flames now, leaping the tops of the tallest grass and traveling ahead of the main wall in bright orange arcs. Behind them, the settlement had begun to burn. He lowered the glasses. Then he turned toward the trail that led down to Ash Hollow. Sarah stepped out of the house. She already knew what he was going to say. She had known since the moment the wind shifted. "How long?" she asked. 20 minutes, maybe less." "Then go." William swung into the saddle of the old wagon horse he kept for short trips. The animal was slower than Juno but steadier under smoke. He rode down the ridge trail at the fastest pace the horse could hold, one arm braced against the saddle horn, his coat already streaked with falling ash before he reached the flat ground below. The settlement was chaos. Families ran between houses with buckets. Men shouted orders that nobody could hear over the wind. A wagon overturned near the general store when its team bolted at the smell of smoke. Dr. Locke was already moving between houses on foot, pulling the elderly widow he had visited 2 days earlier toward the road. William reined his horse to a stop in the middle of the settlement and shouted the only words that mattered. "The ridge, my house, the plowed ground. Now, bring your animals, leave everything else." For a moment, nobody moved. Half a year of jokes and dismissals hung in the air between him and the crowd. Then Dr. Locke lifted his head from the widow's shoulder and answered for all of them. "Do as he says, every one of you, now." The settlement broke into motion. Locke's voice carried a weight the others did not question, and William did not wait for a second confirmation. He wheeled the horse and started back up the trail, calling names as he went. Families followed, some on foot, some on horseback, some driving wagons piled with children and blankets. A few led milk cows on ropes. One boy of 10 ran alongside his mother's skirt with a hen clutched under each arm. Scott Brennan was among the last to leave his porch. He stood staring at the edge of his yard, where the small orange point had grown into a running line of flame. His wife pulled at his sleeve. Their 2 boys were already in the wagon. Scott finally moved, but his face carried an expression William would not fully understand until later that night. The trail up the ridge was less than a mile, but the wind pushed at their backs the entire way. Embers landed in the manes of the horses. A wagon canvas caught briefly and was beaten out with a soaked coat. Behind them, the settlement had begun to burn in earnest. The Brennan house went first, then the general store, then the timber cabins along the creek. At the top of the ridge, William was already moving people through the plowed break, animals to the trench, children inside the house, adults with wet blankets along the north wall. He repeated the instructions twice, in the same steady voice he had used to move men out of an artillery line at Chickamauga. Sarah stood at the door of the sod house, guiding families inside and directing them toward the root cellar. The interior of the house filled quickly. 19 people, then 20, then 21 when a family arrived late leading a lame ox. Juno stood calm in her trench. 2 other horses were led in beside her and tied to the same stake. 3 milk cows were placed in a shallow depression on the east side of the house, downwind of the animals that spooked easiest. The boy with the hens set them down inside an overturned wash tub and weighted the rim with a stone. The birds went silent immediately. Ranger did not move from the northwest corner. William walked the perimeter one final time. The plowed ring held, 30 feet of turned earth. Not a single stem of grass had survived his rake. The wind carried embers over the break in dozens, then hundreds, but each one landed on bare dirt and died within seconds. A few reached the sod walls of the house and glowed briefly against the packed earth before going dark. The main fire line arrived 4 minutes later. The sound came first. A low roar, deeper than thunder, that pressed against the chest before the flames themselves appeared. Then the wall crested the rise to the northwest, a moving cliff of orange and black that stood 20 feet high and reached from horizon to horizon. The heat struck the ridge like a physical blow. Inside the sod house, a child began to cry and was quickly shushed by an older sister. William stood at the door and watched the fire meet the plowed break. It slowed. Then it split. The flame line divided around the bare ring the way a river divides around a stone. On either side of the homestead, the fire continued east at full speed, consuming everything in its path. But within the plowed circle, nothing burned. The grass was gone. The fuel was gone. The fire had nothing to eat. The wall of flame passed on both sides of the ridge for nearly 6 minutes. 6 minutes that felt like an hour. When the last of the main line moved past, the ridge stood in a lake of scorched black earth, and the sod house sat untouched at its center. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The roar of the fire receded into the distance, replaced by a strange, ringing silence broken only by the crackle of scattered embers still burning in the plowed dirt. Smoke hung low over the ridge in thick gray sheets. The air smelled of burnt grass and hot iron. William stepped away from the door and walked slowly to the northwest corner where Ranger still sat. The old collie had not moved through any of it. His fur was flecked with ash. His eyes were fixed on the horizon where the fire had gone. William rested his good hand on the dog's head for a long moment before turning back toward the house. Inside, families were beginning to emerge from the root cellar. Faces were streaked with soot. A young mother clutched a bundled infant against her shoulder and would not put the child down. An old man sat on the packed dirt floor with his back against the sod wall and wept without sound. Dr. Locke moved among them, checking eyes for smoke damage, listening to chests, quietly counting heads. 21 people, every soul who had left the settlement, all alive. Sarah stood at the stove, which had somehow stayed lit through the passage of the fire. She was already heating water for tea. 2 women moved to help her without being asked. The ordinary work of hands settled the room in a way words could not. Outside, the survivors began to walk the perimeter. What they saw silenced anyone who had been about to speak. The plowed ring showed clearly where the fire had struck and split. Beyond the ring, in every direction, the prairie was gone. Black earth stretched to the horizon, dotted with the skeletons of burnt cottonwoods and the smoking remains of what had been Ash Hollow 90 minutes earlier. Not one timber building remained. Not one fence line. Not one haystack. The creek that Jonas Reeve had trusted to stop any fire was a dark scar cutting through a field of ash. Scott Brennan stood at the edge of the plowed break and stared at the horizon where his home had been. His wife stood a few steps behind him, a hand resting on their older boy's shoulder. Scott did not move for a long time. When he finally turned around, he walked directly to the door of the sod house and stopped in front of William. His face was gray. His hands hung at his sides. The other survivors began to notice, and the movement in the yard slowed. A small crowd gathered without meaning to. Scott's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the people closest had to lean forward to hear it. "It was me." William did not answer. He waited. "My pipe on the porch. I knocked it out into the grass. I saw the ash fall. I didn't check it." Scott's throat worked around the next words. "I started it. All of it. The store, the Peterson place, the Millers. My own house." He looked past William toward the sod walls. "Everything you warned us about. I laughed the loudest, and I started the fire that took it all." The silence that followed was deeper than the silence after the flames had passed. 21 people stood in a rough half-circle around the two men. Sarah had come to the doorway. Dr. Locke lowered the pad he had been writing on. Even the children seemed to understand that something was happening that would matter later. William looked at Scott for a long time. He looked at the burnt horizon behind him. He looked at the wife and the two boys standing a few paces back. He looked at the plowed ring that had saved every one of them. Then he spoke. "Then you'll learn to cut sod." Scott's face crumpled at the words. He had come expecting anger. He had come expecting to be driven off the ridge with his family behind him. What he received instead unmade him more completely than any accusation could have. He stood in the plowed dirt with his mouth open and could not find a reply. His wife stepped forward and took his arm. The older boy watched his father with an expression no 10-year-old should have to wear. William turned to the crowd. His voice carried the same steady tone he had used to move people up the ridge. "Nobody sleeps under open sky tonight. There's room in the house for the children and the elderly. The rest of us build lean-tos against the south wall before dark. Tomorrow we start cutting. Every family gets walls before the first snow." Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Jonas Reeve, who had spent an hour in June explaining why sod houses could not stand, stepped forward and asked quietly what tools were needed. William told him. Reeve nodded once and went to find the men who were still able to swing a blade. The work began the next morning at first light. William walked the ridge with a stick and marked out foundation lines for 4 houses along the eastern slope, where the wind broke gently against the rise. Sarah organized the women into cooking and water crews. Dr. Locke rode down to what was left of the settlement to search for anything that could be salvaged. He came back with 2 iron stoves, a barrel of nails that had somehow survived inside a root cellar, and news that the fire had burned itself out against the river 6 miles east. Scott Brennan reported to William at sunrise, with his sleeves rolled up and his hands already blistered from a night of dragging burnt timbers off the wagon trail. William handed him a cutting knife without speaking. Scott took it. For the next 3 weeks, the two men worked side by side, and neither of them spoke about the pipe again. The sod came up in the same heavy mats William had cut for his own walls in the spring. The plowed ring had spared a wide crescent of unburned prairie on the lee side of the ridge, and the grass there stood thick and dense, roots woven tight, exactly the material the new houses needed. The fire that had destroyed everything else had preserved, by a strange geometry of wind and turned earth, the one resource the survivors could not have replaced. Jonas Reeve turned out to be a fast learner. Within a week, he was directing the roof framing on the first house and had begun sketching modifications of his own. A steeper pitch on the north side, a double doorway with an airlock chamber to hold heat, a ventilation channel cut through the ridgepole to draw smoke cleanly from the stove. William looked at the sketches and approved most of them without changes. By the 3rd week, 4 houses stood in various stages of completion along the eastern slope. By the 5th, all 4 were roofed. Dr. Locke moved between them each evening, checking on the children and the 2 elderly residents who had taken the hardest toll from the smoke. He kept his small pad in his coat pocket and continued making notes. The first snow arrived on the 8th of November. It fell quietly through the night and covered the ridge in a soft white blanket by morning. Inside 4 new sod houses and 1 older one, 21 people slept warm behind walls 2 feet thick. Thaddeus Boone rode out from the county seat 3 days later, having heard rumors he could not quite believe. He walked the ridge in silence for nearly an hour before stopping in front of William at the door of the original house. "I owe you an apology," he said. William only nodded. Boone did more than apologize. Within a month, he had ridden to the county seat with a written account of what had happened at Ash Hollow, signed by Dr. Locke, Jonas Reeve, and 11 other survivors. The county commissioners read it twice. Then they asked William Hale to come and speak. He did not want to go. Sarah convinced him. "You built a wall the fire couldn't cross," she told him one evening at the stove. "Now build one for the next town." He rode to the county seat the following week with a folded sketch in his coat pocket and a list of numbers he had written out in his own hand: wall thickness, roof pitch, Firebreak width measured against wind speed, distance between structures, setback from tall grass. The commissioners listened for 2 hours. They asked questions. They asked more questions. When William left the room, one of them turned to the others and said only, "Write it down, all of it." The county's first fire and construction ordinance was signed into effect on the 14th of February, 1875. Every new homestead within the boundary was required to plow a break of not less than 25 feet around any dwelling before the first day of October each year. Every structure raised within the county's dry belt was required to include walls of sod or masonry on at least the windward exposure. The regulations carried no author's name on the document itself, but everyone in the county knew whose hand had shaped them. Ash Hollow was rebuilt, though not in the same place. The survivors chose ground higher on the ridge, near William's original claim, and laid out the new settlement along the sheltered slope where the 4 sod houses already stood. Scott Brennan built the 5th house himself, brick by brick, with his older boy holding the cutting line. He never touched a pipe again. Jonas Reeve became the settlement's builder in a way he had never quite been before. He carried a small notebook of his own now, filled with sketches of ventilation channels and airlock doors and drainage trenches. Some of the sketches were his. Many were William's. He never pretended otherwise. Dr. Ephraim Locke lived another 11 years. On the wall of his examination room, he hung a single framed page torn from the county ordinance, with one line underlined in ink. Every dwelling shall be built with regard to the direction of prevailing wind. He told visitors when they asked that it was the finest sentence ever written in the county. William and Sarah Hale lived out their years in the original sod house on the ridge. They added a second room in 1878 and a small stable of stacked sod for Juno the following spring. Ranger stayed with them for 6 more winters. When the old collie finally died, William buried him at the northwest corner of the plowed ring, where he had sat facing the horizon on the afternoon the fire came. The spot never grew grass again, and William never planted any there. The bronze plaque came later after William himself was gone. The community raised it near the door of the original house. The inscription was short. It named no hero. It described no genius. He plowed where others planted. The prairie remembered. Time continued moving forward. Grass returned to the burned country within 2 seasons. New homesteaders arrived and were handed a copy of the county ordinance before they ever chose their ground. Some of them read it carefully. Some of them did not. The ones who did built houses that lasted. Even decades later, visitors walking the ridge noticed something remarkable. Around the old sod house, in a wide, faint circle still visible in the right light, the grass grew a slightly different color than the prairie beyond it. The plowed ring had never fully disappeared. The prairie had simply chosen to remember. If you enjoyed this story of quiet courage and hard-earned wisdom, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who values these forgotten frontier lessons, and leave a comment telling us which part moved you most. Subscribe to hear more stories of the men and women who built the American West with patience, foresight, and steady hands. Thank you for listening.